Now, President Biden has said Americans must be united against political violence, saying democracy itself will be on the ballot in next week's midterm elections. Mr. Biden accused Donald Trump and his supporters of undermining democracy for refusing to accept the results of the 2020 presidential election. He was speaking at Washington's Union Station, just a few blocks away from the U.S. Capitol, where last year violent protesters tried to overturn the results of the 2020 ballots, referring to the attack on House Speaker's husband, Nancy Pelosi, in San Francisco. He said people must settle their differences at the ballot box rather than through violence.
We don't settle our differences in America with a riot, a mob, or a bullet, or a hammer. We settle them peaceably at the ballot box. We have to be honest with ourselves, though. We have to face this problem. We can't turn away from it. We can't pretend it's just going to solve itself. There's an alarming rise in the number of our people in this country condoning political violence or simply remaining silent, because silence is complicity. You have the power. It's your choice. It's your decision. The fate of the nation, the fate of the soul of America lies where it always does, with the people, in your hands, in your heart, and your ballot.
Joe Biden. Well, for more on that speech, let's cross live to Washington and speak to Arise correspondent, U.S. correspondent Eric Ham. Eric, good to see you. And let's start, first of all, with what President Biden said in that speech about democracy itself being in peril. I'm wondering, in places like Georgia, a state in which both the governor and Secretary of State stood up to President Trump in 2020, but also a state where Republicans backed a new law that makes it more difficult for people to mail in or cast absentee votes in Georgia. How does a speech like that play?
Well, what the president believes, and we're told from our sources inside the White House, that this is a speech that Joe Biden wanted to give for quite some time. And what actually pushed him to give this speech yesterday is the fact that we saw this heinous attack on the husband of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. We do know that Joe Biden is a very dear friend, both with the Speaker as well as her husband. And so this was his moment to, again, draw this line in the sand as we continue to see political violence and a growing discord in the politics of the United States. And so what the president is doing is laying out what the stark contrast is. And what he's doing is he's taking this to a 30,000 foot level, saying, so this is not just about the issues or who is going to be in charge of governing. This is about whether or not U.S. democracy will continue to thrive and continue to be a presence and a mainstay in the United States. And so that's how he is trying to set this election up and make it bigger than either inflation or the economy or abortion or anything like that. But this is about whether or not people want to continue to see democracy as a focal point and as a governing and leading strategy in the United States, or if, in fact, they want to support a party that he believes is increasingly growing more fascist and making it very difficult to enact those basic freedoms that we have continued to see the United States not only enjoy for hundreds of years, but also continue to try to export around the world.
And Eric, you talked about fascist, and you also talked about the other day about Georgia being a key state, which is why I'm kind of banging on about it a bit. I mean, there are far-right Republicans who are standing for office in that state, not least Herschel Walker, who's been endorsed by President Trump. I mean, to what extent are people like that representative? Are other Republicans distancing themselves from people like that?
No, not at all. In fact, Charles, well, you talk about Georgia, and that is certainly the case. But also what we are continuing to hear from a number of Republicans that are running in this election cycle, from Georgia to Pennsylvania to Arizona, there are election deniers on the ballot who could, in fact, who could actually win in this election cycle, who could serve as governor, as secretary of state, as senator, U.S. senator for these respective states. And that's why the president made this speech when he did yesterday, because he believes that this is now a growing threat to the United States. In fact, it's not just the president where this is coming from. The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security are now calling and raising the alarm that the threat to the United States, the threat to the homeland is no longer coming from outside of the United States, but the threat is actually coming from within. They believe that right now there is a growing threat of fascism, a growing violent political threat. In fact, Charles, just to give you some idea of where we stand right now, back in 2016, there were just under 500 total threats made against lawmakers in Washington. Charles, in 2021, that number is now at more than 9,000 total threats made against lawmakers in Washington. And so what we're seeing here is not only the growing threat, but to the physical presence of lawmakers in Washington, but the threat itself to American democracy. And so President Biden is making that push. He's making that argument only 5 days out before the election. The good news is, even though you do see a number of states, including Georgia, where there is growing concern about the access to the ballot box, we are seeing an increase in voting across the country. And so that actually bodes well.
Nevertheless, in spite of that focus by President Biden on the whole idea of democracy being undermined, the cost of living crisis is not getting any better. And that's a big deal for a lot of people, isn't it, going into this election?
Yeah, that's right. In fact, even as President Biden made this speech yesterday, which the cable news outlets covered, and he is attempting to try to make this an issue about the survivability, the viability of democracy, it simply is not the priority for most Americans that are going to the polls. Most Americans are caring about the rise of inflation, the cost of food prices, the cost of gasoline prices, and how that's impacting their pocketbooks and what it means going forward. We do know that the U.S. Federal Reserve raised interest rates, and now there is growing concern about what that will mean, not only for car payments, for car prices, for home prices, but also for credit card payments when we're talking about interest rates. And so many Americans are looking at this. They're deeply concerned about this. And that is actually what's driving people right now. It's not Dobbs or the issue of abortion or democracy. It's how are these lawmakers going to impact my decision in terms of what I buy or how I can buy based on what they do in Washington or in the state legislatures across the country.
And Eric, I want to thank you very much indeed for helping us understand what the issues are going into those midterms. Eric Ham is Arise US correspondent, and he was talking to me from Washington.